In the harshest winter upstate New York had witnessed in over a century, Michael Blackwood's tranquil Saturday morning transformed into an encounter that would challenge everything he understood about wildlife behavior. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The digital thermometer, mounted on his rustic cabin's exterior wall, flickered between an unprecedented -45 and -46 degrees Fahrenheit as Arctic winds tore through the Adirondack Mountains with unrelenting fury. But it wasn't the bone-chilling temperature that caused his steaming mug of artisanal coffee to crash onto his reclaimed wood floors. It was the extraordinary sight beyond his frost-etched bay window. Living in the remote outskirts of Lake Placid, had prepared Michael for all manner of wildlife encounters during his 15 years as a wildlife photographer. The pristine wilderness surrounding his custom-built cabin had provided him with countless opportunities to capture remarkable moments of nature in its purest form. Yet nothing in his extensive experience could have prepared him for what he witnessed on this frigid February morning. His trained eye, accustomed to observing animal behavior through his camera lens, immediately noticed something peculiar about the massive grizzly bear standing upright against his window. The creature's dense fur, normally a rich brown, appeared crystallized, creating an ethereal coating of ice that sparkled in the weak winter sunlight. But it wasn't the bear's appearance that sent shivers down Michael's spine. It was its behavior. The bear's enormous paw moved with deliberate precision against his double-paned window, creating a pattern that defied all natural explanation. This wasn't the random movement of a desperate animal seeking food or shelter. This was something else entirely. The rhythmic tapping seemed almost intentional. Behind the massive creature, 3 small cubs huddled together, their tiny bodies shaking violently against the merciless wind that howled through the mountain pass. Michael's extensive knowledge of bear behavior screamed that this was impossible. Bears should be deep in hibernation during these winter months, safely tucked away in their dens until spring's warm embrace. Their presence here now spoke of a catastrophe that had driven them from their winter sanctuary. His photographer's instinct urged him to reach for his nearby camera, but something in the mother bear's eyes stopped him cold. Those eyes, intelligent, and filled with an urgency that seemed almost human, locked onto his with an intensity that transcended the natural barrier between species. The smallest cub suddenly collapsed into the deep snow, its delicate frame barely visible against the white expanse. The mother's reaction would become the first of many moments that would force Michael to question everything he thought he knew about wild animals. With movements that displayed both power and gentle precision, she scooped up her fallen cub, cradling it with impossible tenderness. Instead of retreating into the forest or displaying the aggressive behavior typical of a mother bear protecting her young, she did something that would later make wildlife experts around the world question their understanding of animal cognition. The massive creature returned to Michael's window, holding her weakest cub against the glass. The message in her actions was unmistakable. She wasn't just seeking shelter, she was actively asking for help. The remaining cubs pressed closer to their mother, their small bodies trembling so violently that Michael could see it even through the frost-covered glass. The mother bear's movements became increasingly deliberate, alternating between checking her struggling cubs and making gestures at the window that seemed impossible for a wild animal. As the bitter wind intensified, driving the temperature even lower, Michael watched in astonishment as the mother bear performed a series of actions that would soon become the most documented case of intelligent animal behavior in recent history. She gathered snow in her massive paw and began making distinct marks on his window, movements so precise they appeared almost like primitive attempts at communication. The emergency alerts blaring from Michael's phone warned of an approaching Arctic front that would drive temperatures to even more dangerous levels. The mother bear's actions grew more urgent, more desperate. She gathered her cubs closer, their small bodies pressing against her for warmth, but the ice forming on their fur told Michael that their natural defenses against the cold were failing. Just when Michael thought the situation couldn't become more extraordinary, the mother bear did something that would later be studied by wildlife behavioral experts worldwide. She sat back on her haunches, raised both paws in what could only be described as a pleading gesture, and held them there. Her eyes, filled with an intelligence that seemed to transcend the natural world, remained fixed on Michael's face. The severity of the situation escalated as Michael observed the mother bear's increasingly sophisticated attempts to communicate. Her massive form cast long shadows across his snow-covered deck as she alternated between tending to her cubs and performing a series of gestures that seemed impossible for a wild animal. The largest cub, its fur now completely encrusted with ice, stumbled against its mother's leg, while the middle one burrowed deeper into her side, seeking warmth that was rapidly depleting. Michael's extensive experience photographing wildlife had taught him to recognize signs of distress in animals, but this was different. The mother bear's actions displayed a level of awareness that contradicted everything he understood about ursine behavior. She began a series of movements so deliberate that Michael found himself reaching for his phone to record, though his hands trembled too much to press the button. The bear's next action left him questioning his own sanity. She carefully cleared a patch of snow on his deck with methodical sweeps of her paw, creating a smooth surface. Then, using her claws with surgical precision, she began etching marks into the frozen wood. The patterns weren't random. They formed crude but distinct shapes that seemed to follow a logical sequence. After each mark, she would look up at Michael, then gesture toward her cubs, establishing a clear connection between her markings and her family's dire situation. His security cameras, installed to capture wildlife footage for his photography work, whirred quietly as they documented this unprecedented behavior. The mother bear, seemingly aware of the recording devices, positioned herself perfectly in their view, as if ensuring her actions would be properly documented. Her understanding of human technology appeared to extend beyond mere coincidence. The wind howled with renewed intensity, driving sheets of snow horizontally across his property. The temperature display now flickered between -47 and -48 degrees, numbers that seemed impossible even for the harsh Adirondack winter. The smallest cub, barely visible beneath its coating of ice, made a sound that pierced Michael's heart, a weak, plaintive cry that carried clearly through the thick glass. The mother bear's response to her cub's distress demonstrated a level of problem-solving ability that would later become the subject of countless scientific studies. She quickly gathered snow into a compact mound, shaped it with her paws into a crude shelter, and tried to position her cubs within it. When this proved insufficient against the brutal cold, she returned to the window with renewed determination. Her next series of actions displayed an understanding of cause and effect that seemed impossible for a wild animal. she began pointing deliberately between Michael's front door and her cubs, making a clear opening motion with her paw. Then, in a gesture that would later be analyzed frame by wildlife experts, she backed away from the door and lowered her head in what could only be interpreted as a submissive posture. Michael watched, transfixed, as she repeated this sequence 3 times, each repetition more precise than the last. The message was unmistakable. She wasn't just asking for help. She was communicating a specific plan and showing deference to his authority over the space. The intelligence behind these actions suggested a level of cognitive ability that would challenge our understanding of animal consciousness. The severity of the cub's condition became increasingly apparent. The ice forming on their fur had begun to create rigid patches that restricted their movement, and their shivering had taken on a concerning irregularity. The mother bear, observing these signs with obvious distress, intensified her efforts to communicate. She began a series of vocalizations unlike anything Michael had ever heard in his years of wildlife observation. Not growls or roars, but complex patterns of sounds that seemed deliberately modulated. Standing at his window, camera forgotten, in his hands, Michael felt himself at the crossroads of what would become one of the most significant human-wildlife encounters ever documented. The mother bear's eyes met his again, and in that moment, he saw something that transcended the traditional boundaries between humans and wild animals. A desperate intelligence that understood exactly what it was asking and the magnitude of the trust it was placing in him. As if to emphasize the urgency of their situation, the smallest cub attempted to stand, but collapsed immediately, its strength finally giving out against the brutal cold. The mother's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. She rushed to her fallen cub, tried to lift it with her mouth, but her own movements had become sluggish from the extreme cold. The remaining cubs huddled closer, their small bodies providing what little warmth they could to their fallen sibling. The mother bear's final attempt to communicate would become the most studied moment of the entire encounter. She returned to the window one last time, pressed her forehead against the glass, and raised both paws in what appeared to be a pleading gesture. The look in her eyes carried such clear desperation, such obvious understanding of her family's dire situation, that Michael felt his grip on reality beginning to slip. As the smallest cub lay motionless in the deepening snow, the mother bear's desperate attempts to save her family reached a new level of intensity. The Arctic wind, now howling through the mountain passes with supernatural force, drove the temperature to -49 degrees, a reading that made Michael's digital thermometer flicker erratically, as if even technology struggled to comprehend such extreme cold. The mother bear's response to her dying cub's condition shattered every preconception about wild animal behavior that Michael had developed during his 15 years as a wildlife photographer. With movements that displayed both raw power and impossible gentleness, she gathered her weakest offspring in her massive jaws, approached the window with deliberate steps, and held the cub directly against the glass. The message was devastatingly clear. Time was running out. Michael's security cameras continued their silent vigil, capturing every moment of this extraordinary encounter in high definition. The footage would later become the subject of countless scientific studies and wildlife documentaries. But in that moment, It simply documented a mother's desperate plea to save her children. The bear's movements, captured from multiple angles, showed a level of purposeful behavior that would force experts to re-evaluate everything they thought they knew about animal intelligence. The middle cub, its strength rapidly failing, attempted to stand, but stumbled against its mother's leg. Instead of the typical protective aggression one would expect from a mother bear with threatened cubs, she responded with a series of actions that seemed impossibly calculated. She carefully positioned her weakened cub beside its sibling, then returned to the window with renewed determination. Her largest cub, though still standing, showed signs of severe hypothermia, its movements becoming increasingly uncoordinated. Using her claws with surgical precision, the mother bear began creating new marks on the frost-covered window. Unlike her earlier attempts, these patterns seemed more organized, more deliberate. She would make a series of parallel lines, then look at Michael expectantly, as if checking whether he understood. When he didn't immediately respond, she would wipe the window clean with her paw and start again, each attempt more sophisticated than the last. Michael's phone buzzed with another emergency weather alert, warning of an incoming pressure system that would drive temperatures even lower. The mother bear's reaction to the electronic sound demonstrated an awareness that seemed impossible for a wild animal. She tilted her head toward the device, then intensified her efforts, as if understanding that time was becoming even more critical. The smallest cub had stopped shivering entirely, a deadly sign that Michael recognized from his wilderness survival training. The mother bear's response to this development was immediate and heartbreaking. She began alternating between trying to warm her weakened cub with her own body heat and making increasingly sophisticated attempts to communicate with Michael. Her largest cub, displaying an awareness that seemed to mirror its mother's intelligence, joined in her efforts, placing its small paw against the window in a perfect imitation of her gestures. What happened next would become the most analyzed moment of the entire encounter. The mother bear, seeming to realize that her previous attempts at communication weren't sufficient, began a series of actions that defied explanation. She, methodically, cleared a larger patch of snow on Michael's deck, creating a smooth surface about 6 feet square. Then, with movements that showed impossible precision, she began creating patterns in the snow, not random marks, but organized shapes that appeared to follow a specific logic. After completing each pattern, she would look up at Michael, gesture to her cubs, then point to the door. The sequence was so clearly intentional that Michael found himself instinctively nodding in response. The bear's eyes, showing an intelligence that seemed to transcend species boundaries, locked onto his face with an intensity that made him question everything he thought he knew about wild animals. The remaining conscious cubs, despite their deteriorating condition, participated in their mother's desperate attempt to communicate. The largest cub, though barely able to stand, would add its own marks to its mother's patterns in the snow, creating a display of coordinated behavior that would later leave wildlife experts speechless. The middle cub, growing weaker by the minute, continued to make soft, whimpering sounds that carried through the glass with heart-breaking clarity. As the brutal wind drove sheets of snow against his windows, Michael watched the mother bear make a final, devastating attempt to convey her desperation. She gathered all 3 cubs close to her body, trying to shield them from the lethal cold with her own bulk. Then, in a gesture that would be replayed millions of times on nature documentaries and social media, she pressed her forehead against the window, raised both paws in what could only be described as a pleading gesture, and let out a sound that carried all the anguish of a mother watching her children freeze to death. The look in her eyes as she made this final plea carried such clear intelligence, such obvious understanding of the situation, that Michael felt his entire world-view shifting. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. This was a conscious being making a deliberate choice to trust a human with the lives of her children. The implications of this realization would forever change his understanding of wildlife behavior. The devastating scene continued to unfold as the temperature plummeted even further, pushing the limits of what seemed possible even in the harsh Adirondack winter. Michael's wildlife expertise told him that bears shouldn't even be active in these conditions, let alone displaying such complex behavior. The mother bear's desperate attempts at communication had now evolved into something even more extraordinary, forcing him to question everything he thought he knew about animal intelligence. With movements that seemed to defy the paralyzing cold, the mother bear began a new series of actions that would later become the most studied sequence of the entire encounter. She carefully arranged her cubs in a semicircle, positioning them so they were clearly visible through Michael's bay window. The smallest cub, barely breathing now, lay cradled between its siblings, while the mother bear performed what appeared to be a choreographed series of gestures. For it, she pointed deliberately to each cub in turn, then to the warmth visible through Michael's window. She repeated this sequence 3 times, each repetition more precise than the last. Then, in a display that would later baffle wildlife behaviorists, she began demonstrating what appeared to be a promised behavior pattern. She walked to the door, sat down peacefully, and remained still for several seconds before returning to her cubs. The largest cub, though weakening, joined its mother's desperate demonstration. It followed her to the door, sat quietly just as she had done, then returned to its siblings. This coordinated display of intended behavior seemed impossible for wild animals, yet Michael's security cameras captured every moment in pristine clarity. The footage would later become the centerpiece of several groundbreaking studies on ursine intelligence. Emergency alerts continued to flood Michael's phone as the Arctic front intensified. The wind chill had dropped to -60 degrees, and the National Weather Service was warning of conditions that could cause instant frostbite to exposed skin. The mother bear's reaction to these deteriorating conditions became even more frantic, yet maintained an astounding level of calculated precision. She began a new series of communication attempts, this time incorporating what appeared to be primitive sign language. She would touch her chest, point to her cubs, then make a clear, sheltering motion with her paws. After each sequence, she would look at Michael with an intelligence that seemed to transcend species boundaries, waiting for some sign of understanding. The middle cub's condition had deteriorated significantly during these demonstrations. Its movements had become sluggish, and its attempts to maintain body heat were visibly failing. The mother bear's response to her cub's declining state was both heartbreaking and extraordinary. She gathered snow into a small mound, shaped it into a crude shelter, and tried to position her cubs within it, a temporary solution that she seemed to know would not be enough. Michael's extensive experience with wildlife had taught him to recognize the signs of animals in genuine distress versus those merely seeking easy food or shelter. This situation was unprecedented. The bear's behavior displayed not just desperation, but a level of reasoning that challenged all scientific understanding of animal cognition. She wasn't just reacting to the cold, she was actively problem-solving and attempting to negotiate. The security cameras continued their silent documentation as the mother bear initiated what would become the most analyzed portion of the encounter. She began a series of movements that appeared to demonstrate her understanding of human domestic space. She would point to the door, mime walking carefully, then show herself sitting quietly in a corner. The message was clear. She was promising good behavior in exchange for shelter. Her cubs, despite their deteriorating condition, participated in this extraordinary display of intended conduct. Even the weakest cub, barely conscious, would lift its head slightly during each demonstration, as if adding its own plea to their mother's promises. The largest cub continued to mirror its mother's gestures with uncanny precision, creating a synchronized performance that defied all natural expectations. The wind's intensity increased yet again, driving sheets of ice-laden snow horizontally across Michael's property. The mother bear's response to this new threat demonstrated both her desperation and her remarkable problem-solving abilities. She quickly positioned herself as a windbreak for her cubs, while maintaining her complex attempts at communication with Michael. Each passing minute brought new evidence of the cubs' declining condition. The ice forming on their fur had created rigid patches that restricted their movement, and their breathing had become increasingly labored. The mother bear's awareness of their deteriorating state was evident in her increasingly urgent attempts to convey their desperate situation to Michael. In what would become the most widely shared moment of the entire encounter, the mother bear made one final, heartbreaking attempt to communicate. She gathered her cubs close, arranged them in a perfect line facing Michael's window, and orchestrated what appeared to be a coordinated plea. One by one, each conscious cub raised its paw in a begging gesture, while their mother stood behind them, her own paws raised in a similar position. The family's synchronized movement, captured in perfect detail by Michael's cameras, created an image that would later become synonymous with the unexpected depths of animal intelligence. Time seemed to stand still as Michael witnessed the most critical moment of this extraordinary encounter. The smallest cub had now completely stopped moving, its tiny body barely visible beneath the accumulating snow and ice. The brutal wind continued its relentless assault, driving the temperature to levels that threatened the survival of even the hardiest wildlife. The mother bear's reaction to her cub's critical condition would become the most heart-wrenching footage ever captured on Michael's security cameras. With movements that displayed both desperate urgency and remarkable control, she gently lifted her weakest cub from the snow. Instead of the frantic behavior one might expect from a mother with a dying child, she demonstrated a composure that seemed impossible for a wild animal. She approached Michael's window with slow, deliberate steps, holding her cub at eye level while maintaining unwavering eye contact. The remaining cubs, despite their own deteriorating condition, followed their mother's lead with extraordinary coordination. The middle cub, though barely able to stand, pressed its small paw against the window in perfect alignment with where its sibling was being held. The largest cub positioned itself on their mother's other side, creating a tableau of family unity that would later move millions of viewers to tears. Michael's wildlife photography experience had taught him to recognize pivotal moments in animal behavior, but nothing had prepared him for what happened next. The mother bear, still cradling her weakest cub, began what appeared to be a carefully choreographed demonstration of submission. She lowered herself to a non-threatening position, kept her movements slow and predictable, and maintained a respectful distance from the window while continuing her plea. The emergency alerts on Michael's phone had become constant now, warning of an incoming weather system that would make the current conditions seem mild by comparison. The mother bear's reaction to these electronic sounds demonstrated an awareness that baffled him. Each time his phone buzzed, she would glance at it, then intensify her efforts to communicate, as if understanding that time was becoming even more critical. Using her free paw with impossible precision, she began creating new marks on the frost-covered window. Unlike her earlier attempts, these patterns seemed more organized, more sophisticated. She would make a series of deliberate gestures, wait for any sign of comprehension from Michael, then modify her approach if no understanding was shown. This adaptive communication strategy displayed a level of intelligence that would later become the subject of numerous scientific studies. The middle cub's condition had deteriorated significantly during this sequence. Its movements had become uncoordinated, and its attempts to participate in its mother's demonstrations were growing weaker. The mother bear's response to this development showed both her desperation and her remarkable ability to maintain composed, purposeful behavior under extreme stress. She carefully positioned her weakest cub in a sheltered spot near the window, then began what appeared to be a coordinated effort with her strongest cub to demonstrate their understanding of human domestic space. Together, they enacted a series of behaviors that seemed designed to show their ability to remain calm and controlled inside a human dwelling. The security cameras captured every detail of this extraordinary display. The mother bear would point to different areas around the mime careful movement, then show herself sitting quietly. Her largest cub would mirror these actions with surprising accuracy, creating a synchronized performance that defied all natural expectations. After each demonstration, they would return to check on their struggling siblings, their movements, showing both urgency and remarkable restraint. The wind's savage intensity continued to increase, driving the wind chill to nearly -65 degrees. Ice crystals formed on the bear's fur with frightening speed, creating a crystalline coating that sparkled ominously in the weak winter sunlight. The mother bear's awareness of their rapidly deteriorating situation was evident in her increasingly sophisticated attempts to communicate with Michael. She began a new series of gestures that incorporated elements of all her previous attempts at communication. She would touch her chest, point to her cubs, make a sheltering motion, then demonstrate peaceful behavior. After each sequence, she would check her cubs' condition, adjust their positions to maximize their remaining body heat, and return to her communications with renewed determination. What happened next would become the most studied moment of the entire encounter. The mother bear, seeming to realize that her previous attempts weren't sufficient, initiated what appeared to be a final, coordinated demonstration. She gathered her conscious cubs into a perfect line, positioned herself behind them, and orchestrated what could only be described as a choreographed plea for help. One by one, each bear raised their paw in a begging gesture, creating a synchronized display that seemed impossible for wild animals. The mother bear maintained this formation for several seconds, her eyes never leaving Michael's face. The intelligence and desperation in her gaze carried a message that transcended species barriers. This was her final attempt to save her family. The smallest cub's condition had become critical during this display. Its breathing was barely perceptible, and the ice forming on its fur had created a rigid shell that threatened to completely immobilize it. The mother bear's response to this development would become the defining moment that forced Michael to make an impossible decision. Michael stood frozen at his window, his photographer's instinct warring with basic human compassion. 15 years of wildlife documentation had taught him the cardinal rule: never interfere with nature's course, yet everything about this situation defied natural law. His security cameras continued their silent recording, capturing what would soon become the most significant human-wildlife interaction ever documented in the Adirondacks. The mother bear's eyes remained locked on his, carrying an intelligence that seemed to transcend species boundaries. Her smallest cub lay motionless in the snow, its survival hanging by an increasingly fragile thread. The middle cub had begun showing signs of severe hypothermia, its movements becoming dangerously sluggish. Only the largest cub maintained any significant activity, though even its strength was visibly failing against the brutal cold. His phone buzzed again, displaying a new emergency weather alert that made his blood run cold. The incoming system would drive temperatures down another 15 degrees, creating conditions that no living creature could survive exposed. The mother bear's reaction to his phone's vibration showed an awareness that continued to challenge his understanding of wild animal intelligence. She glanced at the device, then intensified her pleading gestures with renewed urgency. Through the howling wind, Michael could hear the distinct sound of ice forming on his windows, a high-pitched crystalline crescendo that seemed to emphasize the deadly nature of the cold. His security cameras, designed to capture wildlife in their natural state, now documented something entirely unprecedented. A wild animal displaying not just intelligence, but a clear understanding of human communication and social structures. The mother bear made one final, desperate attempt to convey her situation. She gathered her weakest cubs close to her body, trying to share what little warmth remained, while orchestrating what appeared to be a coordinated demonstration with her strongest cub. Together, they enacted a series of behaviors that seemed designed to show their ability to remain calm and controlled inside a human dwelling. Michael's hands trembled as he reached for his phone, not to take photos this time, but to call local wildlife services. The call wouldn't connect. The brutal storm had disrupted cell service throughout the region. He was entirely alone with this impossible decision. His years of experience screamed that introducing wild animals into his home was not just dangerous, but potentially lethal. Yet the scene before him defied every natural law he'd studied. The mother bear's behavior displayed not just desperation, but a level of reasoning that challenged all scientific understanding of animal cognition. She wasn't just reacting to the cold. She was actively problem-solving and attempting to negotiate for her family's survival. As if sensing his internal struggle, the mother bear initiated what would become the most analyzed portion of the entire encounter. She began a series of movements that appeared to demonstrate her understanding of human domestic space. She would point to the door, mime walking carefully, then show herself sitting quietly in a corner. The message was clear. She was promising good behavior in exchange for shelter. The largest cub, despite its weakening condition, continued to participate in this extraordinary display of intended conduct. It would mirror its mother's careful movements, then return to its siblings, maintaining a level of coordinated behavior that seemed impossible for wild animals. The security cameras captured every detail of this remarkable interaction, providing irrefutable evidence of behavior that would later baffle wildlife experts worldwide. A particularly violent gust of wind drove sheets of snow against his windows, with such force that the glass seemed to flex. The temperature display now showed -52 degrees, and the wind chill would make it feel significantly colder. The mother bear's response to this new assault from the elements was immediate and heartbreaking. She gathered her cubs even closer, trying to shield them with her own body, while maintaining her pleading eye contact with Michael. Standing in his warm living room, Michael felt the weight of this moment pressing down on him. His decision would either become a groundbreaking moment in human-wildlife interaction, or a cautionary tale about the dangers of anthropomorphizing wild animals. The mother bear's eyes held his, carrying a desperate question that demanded an immediate answer. What happened in the next few moments would change not just his life, but our entire understanding of animal intelligence and consciousness. Michael took one final look at his security camera feeds, knowing they would capture whatever came next. The mother bear watched his every movement, her eyes showing an understanding that seemed impossible for a wild animal. As his hand moved toward the door handle, time itself seemed to pause. The mother bear's reaction to this simple gesture would become the most studied moment of the entire encounter. She immediately gathered her cubs into a perfect line, positioning them in a way that demonstrated both organization and control. Her movements were so deliberate, so clearly intentional, that Michael felt his last doubts beginning to fade. With trembling hands, Michael grasped his door handle, knowing this moment would forever change his life. The mother bear's reaction to this simple gesture demonstrated a level of understanding that would later leave wildlife experts speechless. Instead of rushing forward or showing any sign of aggression, she maintained her perfect position, keeping her cubs organized in a disciplined line while watching his every movement with impossible patience. The door creaked open slightly, just enough to reach the smallest cub whose life hung by an increasingly fragile thread. The bitter wind immediately invaded his warm living room, bringing with it crystals of ice that stung his exposed skin. But what happened next defied every natural law and would become the most widely studied moment in wildlife behavior history. Instead of charging forward or displaying the protective aggression typical of a mother bear, she did something that would challenge everything scientists thought they knew about wild animal intelligence. With movements that showed remarkable restraint and understanding, she carefully lifted her weakest cub in her powerful jaws. Her approach to the door was slow and deliberate, each step measured and cautious. The remaining cubs, despite their deteriorating condition, maintained their perfect formation, showing none of the panic or disorder one would expect from wild animals in such a desperate situation. They watched their mother with what appeared to be complete understanding, their behavior suggesting a level of comprehension that seemed impossible for young bears. When she reached the threshold, the mother bear did something that would be analyzed frame by frame by wildlife experts worldwide. She gently placed her weakest cub just inside the doorway, then backed away several steps, keeping her head lowered in a clear display of submission. The message was unmistakable. She was placing her trust entirely in Michael's hands. The security cameras captured every detail of this extraordinary moment from multiple angles. The footage would later become the centerpiece of numerous studies on animal intelligence and behavior. The mother bear's actions showed not just intelligence, but a sophisticated understanding of human social boundaries and trust-building behaviors. As the smallest cub lay just inside the warm house, beginning to stir slightly as heat reached its frozen body, the mother bear's next actions proved even more remarkable. Instead of following her cub inside, she began a series of gentle gestures, pointing to her remaining cubs, then to the door, all while maintaining a respectful distance. Her movements were so clearly communicative that Michael found himself nodding in understanding without even realizing it. The brutal wind continued, its assault driving the temperature even lower. Ice crystals formed on the remaining cub's fur with frightening speed, their small bodies trembling violently against the cold. The mother bear's awareness of their deteriorating condition was evident in her increasingly urgent, yet still controlled, gestures. With movements that displayed both desperation and remarkable restraint, she guided her remaining cubs toward the door, keeping them in a perfectly straight line. As each cub approached the threshold, she would gently stop them, making them pause as if seeking permission before entering. This display of control and respect for human boundaries seemed impossible for wild animals, yet Michael's cameras captured every incredible moment. The middle cub crossed the threshold next, its movements weak but carefully controlled under its mother's guidance. It immediately joined its sibling in the designated corner, showing none of the exploratory behavior typical of young bears in a new environment. The largest cub followed with equal discipline, maintaining the ordered behavior that would later baffle wildlife experts. But it was the mother bear's own entrance that would become the most studied aspect of this extraordinary encounter. Before stepping into Michael's home, she performed a series of actions that demonstrated an understanding of human domestic space that seemed impossible for a wild animal. First, she carefully wiped her paws in the snow, removing as much ice and debris as possible. Then she shook her fur thoroughly, dislodging loose snow and ice while still outside. The most astonishing moment came when she paused at the threshold, looking directly at Michael with an intelligence that seemed to transcend species boundaries. Her eyes carried a clear question, seeking final permission before entering his space. This display of awareness and respect for human territory would later become the subject of countless wildlife behavior studies. When Michael stepped aside, her entry into his home showed a level of care and consideration that defied all natural expectations. Each step was deliberate and gentle, despite her massive size. She immediately guided her cubs to the corner furthest from Michael, creating a clear boundary between his space and theirs. Her behavior displayed not just intelligence, but a sophisticated understanding of human social norms that would force scientists to re-evaluate everything they thought they knew about wild animal cognition. The security cameras continued their silent documentation as the extraordinary scene unfolded, capturing every detail of what would soon become the most significant human-wildlife interaction ever recorded in the Adirondacks. The mother bear's careful movements, her cubs' disciplined behavior, and the clear communication between them would provide irrefutable evidence of animal intelligence that went far beyond mere instinct. The scene that unfolded inside Michael's warm living room defied every natural law and challenged everything he thought he knew about wild animal behavior. The mother bear, having just completed her impossibly careful entrance, demonstrated a level of spatial awareness that seemed beyond comprehension for a wild animal. Instead of the chaos one might expect when introducing 4 wild bears into a human dwelling, what happened next would become the most studied aspect of this extraordinary encounter. With movements that displayed remarkable precision, the mother bear began organizing her family in the corner furthest from Michael's valuable photography equipment and furniture. She created a neat, contained space for them, using her massive paws with surprising delicacy to arrange her cubs in a tight group. Her awareness of human property and space would later become a focal point of numerous wildlife behavior studies. The smallest cub, now beginning to respond to the warmth, made soft, whimpering sounds that carried clearly through the room. The mother bear's reaction to her cub's distress demonstrated a level of parental care that went far beyond basic instinct. She gathered some fallen newspapers from nearby, carefully arranged them into a makeshift nest, and gently moved her weakest cub onto this improvised bedding. Michael's security cameras, which had followed the bear's entrance from multiple angles, continued to capture every extraordinary moment. The footage showed the mother bear performing a series of actions that would later leave wildlife experts questioning everything they thought they knew about animal intelligence. She began actively keeping her cubs away from Michael's belongings, using soft vocalizations that seemed almost like whispered instructions. When the middle cub, still weak from its ordeal, stumbled toward a shelf filled with expensive camera lenses, the mother bear's response was immediate and astounding. She gently intercepted her cub, redirected it back to their designated area, and then did something that seemed impossible for a wild animal. She appeared to check the shelf for any disturbance, using her paw with surprising gentleness to ensure nothing had been displaced. The largest cub, though still showing signs of hypothermia, displayed equally remarkable behavior. Instead of exploring its new environment as any young bear would naturally do, it remained perfectly still in their designated corner, following its mother's example of respect for human space. This coordinated family behavior suggested a level of understanding that went far beyond simple training or instinct. As warmth gradually returned to their bodies, the cubs' behavior proved equally shocking. Instead of becoming more energetic or destructive as they recovered, they maintained their extraordinary discipline. They stayed exactly where their mother had placed them, made no loud sounds, and showed none of the wild behavior one would expect from young bears. Their coordination and restraint seemed to suggest an intelligence far beyond what anyone thought possible in bear cubs. The most remarkable moment came when Michael's cat, Whiskers, emerged cautiously from behind the sofa. Everyone in the room froze, expecting the worst, but what happened next left Michael questioning everything he thought he knew about wild animals. The mother bear immediately pulled her cubs closer and made a soft rumbling sound that seemed to communicate a clear message of restraint. To Michael's utter amazement, the cubs sat perfectly still, watching the cat with curious but unthreatening eyes. The mother bear then did something extraordinary. She lowered her head to the cat's level and remained motionless, as if trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. This understanding of how to interact with a domestic animal showed a level of social intelligence that would later baffle wildlife experts. As the cubs continued to recover, Their behavior became even more remarkable when one of them accidentally knocked over a small decorative vase. The mother bear's response was immediate and shocking. She carefully picked up the vase and, in a gesture that would later be studied endlessly by wildlife behavior experts, attempted to place it back exactly where it had been. The mother bear's attention to cleanliness and order within Michael's home became increasingly apparent. She began what appeared to be an organized cleanup routine, gathering the snow and ice that had fallen from their fur into neat piles. She used fallen newspapers to wipe up watermarks from their wet paws, and continuously checked Michael's reaction to ensure her actions met with his approval. This wasn't just intelligent behavior. This was something that would challenge our entire understanding of wild animal consciousness. The cubs, now fully warmed, showed equally shocking awareness. They mimicked their mother's careful movements, avoided touching furniture, and maintained what could only be described as perfect guest behavior. When Michael cautiously offered them water in a bowl, they waited for their mother's permission. Before drinking, then carefully avoided spilling any on his floor. The security cameras continued their silent documentation of this impossible scene, capturing every moment of what would soon become the most significant evidence of advanced animal intelligence ever recorded. The mother bear's careful supervision of her family, her respect for human property, and her cubs' extraordinary discipline created a picture of animal behavior that would force scientists to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about wild animal cognition. Inside Michael's warm living room, the extraordinary scene continued to unfold in ways that challenged every known principle of wild animal behavior. The mother bear's actions grew increasingly sophisticated as her cubs regained their strength, demonstrating a level of awareness and consideration that seemed impossible for wild animals. Instead of spreading through the house or searching for food, she maintained her family in a neat, organized group near the fireplace, showing an understanding of human space that defied explanation. The cubs, now fully warmed and alert, displayed behavior that would later become the subject of countless wildlife studies. Rather than becoming more energetic or destructive as their strength returned, they followed their mother's example with remarkable precision. They stayed within their designated area, moved with careful deliberation, and showed none of the exploratory behavior typical of young bears in a new environment. Perhaps the most astonishing development came when Michael's phone rang unexpectedly. Everyone in the room froze, but instead of panicking or showing aggression, the mother bear's response demonstrated an impossible level of situational awareness. She calmly gathered her cubs closer and waited until the noise stopped. Then, in a gesture that would later be analyzed frame by behavioral experts, she pointed to the phone, then to herself, then to the door, as if communicating that it was time for them to leave before more humans arrived. The intelligence displayed in this simple sequence of gestures was mind-boggling. Not only had she recognized the phone as a communication device, but she had also understood its implications for their situation. This level of comprehension and reasoning would later become the subject of numerous scientific studies on animal cognition. Michael's security cameras captured every detail as the mother bear began preparing her family for departure. Her actions continued to shock him as she guided her cubs through what appeared to be a systematic checkout process. She ensured they hadn't left any mess behind, used fallen newspapers to wipe up any remaining watermarks, and kept checking his reaction to confirm her actions met with approval. When one of the cubs accidentally brushed against a bookshelf, the mother bear's response was immediate and extraordinary. She gently redirected her cub, then carefully examined the shelf to ensure nothing had been disturbed. This awareness of human belongings and desire to maintain order went far beyond any known examples of animal behavior. The cubs' participation in this cleanup routine proved equally remarkable. They followed their mother's example with surprising precision, using their paws to gather any fallen debris into neat piles and avoiding contact with Michael's furniture and belongings. Their coordinated efforts suggested a level of understanding that seemed impossible for young bears. As the family prepared to leave, the mother bear orchestrated a scene that would become the most viewed wildlife video of the year. Standing near the front door, she lined up her cubs in a perfect row and began what could only be described as a farewell ceremony. Each cub, following their mother's gentle guidance, performed a series of gestures that seemed deliberately designed to express gratitude. The smallest cub, now fully recovered, stepped forward first. Following its mother's example, it placed its paw over its heart, then extended it toward Michael in a gesture so deliberate it could not be mistaken for anything else. The middle cub followed, adding a small bow to its farewell, while the largest cub completed its goodbye with a soft whimper that sounded remarkably like an attempt at human gratitude. But it was the mother bear's final gesture that would leave Michael speechless. She approached him with slow, careful movements, maintaining perfect eye contact. Then, in a display that would challenge every known principle of wild animal behavior, she gently placed her massive paw on his arm for just a moment. The gesture carried such clear meaning, such obvious gratitude, that Michael felt tears welling. In his eyes, throughout this extraordinary farewell sequence, the security cameras continued their silent documentation, capturing every impossible moment in high definition. The footage would later become the centerpiece of numerous studies on animal intelligence and behavior, forcing experts to re-evaluate everything they thought they knew about wild animal cognition. As they prepared to exit, the mother bear performed one final act that demonstrated her remarkable awareness of human domestic space. She carefully cleaned the area around the door, using fallen snow to wipe away any marks their paws had left. Then she gathered her cubs close, and with movements that showed impossible restraint, began their orderly departure. Each cub stepped carefully over the doormat, avoiding tracking any snow back into the house. Their coordinated exit displayed a level of awareness and consideration that seemed beyond the capabilities of wild animals. But it was the mother bear's final action that would become the most studied moment of the entire encounter. As they prepared to leave, she turned back one last time, her eyes meeting Michael's with an intelligence that would forever change his understanding of wildlife. In a final display that would challenge every known principle of wild animal behavior, the mother bear orchestrated their departure with impossible precision. Standing at the threshold between Michael's warm living room and the brutal winter storm outside, she performed a series of actions that would later become the most studied footage in wildlife behavior history. Her movements showed not just intelligence, but a sophisticated understanding of human social customs that seemed beyond comprehension. First, she carefully inspected the area where her family had rested, using her massive paws with surprising delicacy to ensure they hadn't left any trace of their presence. When she discovered a small wet patch from their melted snow, she shocked Michael by using fallen newspapers to carefully dry the spot. This attention to detail and respect for human property went far beyond any documented examples of wild animal behavior. The cubs, following their mother's example, participated in this extraordinary cleanup routine with remarkable precision. Each cub used its paws to gather any debris into neat piles, moved with careful deliberation to avoid touching furniture, and maintained perfect formation as they prepared to leave. Their coordinated efforts suggested a level of understanding that would later force scientists to reevaluate everything they knew about animal intelligence. As the brutal wind howled outside, the mother bear began what appeared to be a carefully choreographed farewell ceremony. She lined up her cubs in a perfect row near the door, positioning them so that Michael's security cameras could capture every incredible moment. The footage would later become the centerpiece of numerous studies on animal cognition and behavior. The smallest cub, now fully recovered from its near-death experience, stepped forward first. Following its mother's gentle guidance, it performed a series of gestures that seemed impossible for a wild animal. It placed its paw over its heart, then extended it toward Michael in a clear expression of gratitude. The middle cub followed, adding a small bow to its farewell, while the largest cub completed the sequence with a soft sound that carried unmistakable thankfulness. But it was the mother bear's final interactions with Michael's home that would leave viewers of the security footage questioning everything they thought they knew about wild animals. She began a systematic check of their exit path, ensuring they hadn't disturbed anything during their stay. When she discovered a small smudge on the window from their earlier pleading, she used snow from outside to carefully clean it. The most extraordinary moment came when Michael's cat, Whiskers, approached to watch their departure. Instead of showing any aggression or fear, the mother bear gathered her cubs close and made a soft, rumbling sound that seemed to calm both her family and the cat. This understanding of interspecies interaction displayed a level of social intelligence that would later baffle wildlife experts. As they prepared to step out into the storm, the mother bear performed one final act that demonstrated her remarkable awareness of human customs. She gathered her cubs into a tight formation and began what appeared to be a practiced exit routine. Each cub carefully wiped its paws before crossing the threshold, showing a level of consideration for human space that seemed impossible for wild animals. The security cameras captured every detail as the family made their final preparations to face the brutal cold. The mother bear's movements showed both urgency to protect her cubs from the elements and a determined commitment to leave Michael's home exactly as they had found it. She made one final inspection of their resting area, adjusted a small rug they had disturbed, and then turned to face Michael. In what would become the most widely shared moment of the entire encounter, she approached him with slow, deliberate steps, her eyes showing an intelligence that seemed to transcend species boundaries, locked onto his face. Then, in a gesture that would be analyzed countless times by behavioral experts, she gently placed her paw on his arm and held it there for a moment. The meaning behind this touch was unmistakable. It carried all the weight of a heartfelt thank you from one parent to another soul who had helped save their children. The cubs watched this interaction with remarkable patience, maintaining their perfect formation near the door while their mother completed this final gesture of gratitude. As they finally stepped out into the howling wind, the mother bear orchestrated their departure with the same extraordinary care she had shown throughout their visit. She positioned herself to shield her cubs from the worst of the wind, maintained their tight formation, and began their journey back into the wild. But before disappearing into the swirling snow, she turned one final time. What happened next would become the most replayed moment of the security footage. The mother bear raised her paw in what could only be described as a wave goodbye, and to Michael's utter amazement, each cub copied their mother's gesture in perfect synchronization. This coordinated farewell display was so shocking, so seemingly impossible, that Michael had to grab his doorframe for support. The family's departure into the storm showed the same remarkable organization and discipline that had characterized their entire visit. The mother bear kept her cubs in a tight formation, moving away from the house with deliberate care. They didn't scatter or rush, but maintained a dignified pace, occasionally looking back at Michael as they made their way into the forest. Michael stood in his doorway, watching the extraordinary family disappear into the swirling snow, his entire understanding of wildlife transformed in the span of a few hours. The bears hadn't just sought shelter, they had displayed a level of intelligence, gratitude, and respect that would force humans to re-evaluate everything they thought they knew about wild animals. The security cameras had captured every incredible moment, providing irrefutable evidence of behavior that would soon challenge the scientific community's understanding of animal cognition. As the last bear disappeared into the trees, Michael found himself drawn to his surveillance system's display screen. The footage he was watching seemed almost impossible, a perfect record of what might be the most significant human-wildlife interaction ever documented. Each camera angle revealed new details that made the encounter even more extraordinary than he had realized while it was happening. The initial approach of the desperate family played out in crystal-clear detail. The mother bear's first deliberate knocks on his window, her careful positioning of her cubs, and the sophisticated series of gestures she had used to communicate their dire situation. The cameras had captured every nuance of her increasingly complex attempts to convey their need for help, showing a level of intentional communication that went far beyond anything previously documented in wild animals. Even more remarkable was the footage of their time inside his home. The mother bear's careful supervision of her cubs, their coordinated cleanup efforts, and their extraordinary respect for his property were all preserved in perfect detail. The cameras had captured moments he hadn't even noticed during the encounter. Subtle interactions between mother and cubs that suggested an even deeper level of intelligence and social organization than he had initially recognized. Michael found himself particularly drawn to the footage of their departure preparations. Watching it now, he noticed dozens of small details that had escaped his attention in the moment. The mother bear's systematic inspection of their resting area, her careful cleaning of any marks they had left, and the cubs' coordinated participation in this cleanup routine showed a level of awareness and consideration that seemed impossible for wild animals. The farewell ceremony, viewed through multiple camera angles, became even more extraordinary. Each gesture, each carefully coordinated movement took on new significance when observed from different perspectives. The security footage captured subtle details, the way the mother bear would glance at each cub before they performed their gratitude gestures, the precise timing of their synchronized movements, the careful way she had orchestrated their final moments in his home. As he reviewed the footage, Michael noticed something he had missed entirely during the encounter. Throughout their visit, the mother bear had maintained a consistent pattern of communication with her cubs, a series of subtle gestures and soft vocalizations that appeared to convey specific instructions. This sophisticated system of family communication suggested a level of social organization that went far beyond current scientific understanding of ursine behavior. The cameras had also captured clear evidence of the bear's extraordinary spatial awareness. From above, their movements through his home could be seen following precise, careful patterns, never random or chaotic, but always purposeful and coordinated. The mother bear had maintained perfect awareness of her cubs' positions at all times, adjusting their formation with subtle gestures that the overhead cameras caught in perfect detail. Perhaps most remarkable was the footage of their interactions with his cat, Whiskers. The overhead angle revealed an even more sophisticated sequence of behavior than Michael had realized at the time. The mother bear hadn't just remained calm, she had actively created a safe space for both her cubs and the cat, positioning her family in a way that allowed the cat to observe them without feeling threatened. The final moments of their departure, captured from multiple angles, revealed new layers of complexity in their behavior. The synchronized goodbye wave, when viewed from different perspectives, showed clear evidence of preparation and practice. Each cub had watched their mother's movements carefully, timing their gestures to match hers with impossible precision. As Michael continued reviewing the footage, he noticed that the mother bear had performed one final act that he had missed. Entirely in the moment, just before disappearing into the forest, she had turned back one last time and made a gesture that seemed to encompass his entire property, a movement that appeared to be marking his home as a safe place, a gesture that would later be studied extensively by wildlife behavioral experts. Looking at his perfectly clean, undisturbed living room, Michael found it almost impossible to believe what had just transpired. If it weren't for the security footage playing on his monitors, providing irrefutable evidence of every extraordinary moment, he might have thought he had imagined the whole thing. The only physical evidence of their visit was a single perfect paw print left in the snow outside his door, a final reminder of the most remarkable encounter of his life. His hands trembled slightly as he began the process of saving and backing up the security footage. He knew that what he had witnessed, and more importantly, what his cameras had captured, would force the scientific community to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about wild animal intelligence and behavior. The implications of this encounter would reach far beyond this single extraordinary morning in the Adirondacks. In the days that followed this extraordinary encounter, Michael's security footage began its journey from a private wildlife photographer's documentation to a worldwide sensation that would challenge everything we thought we knew about animal intelligence. The first experts who viewed the footage sat in stunned silence, watching the bears display behavior that defied every established principle of wild animal conduct. Wildlife biologists from leading universities gathered at Michael's remote cabin, their skepticism quickly turning to amazement as they reviewed the footage from every angle. The mother bear's sophisticated communication attempts, her family's coordinated behavior, and their remarkable respect for human space forced these experts to question decades of established research about ursine intelligence. The footage of the bear's initial approach proved particularly fascinating to researchers. Frame-by-frame analysis revealed layers of complexity in the mother bear's communication attempts that went far beyond anything previously documented in wild animals. Her deliberate use of gesture sequences, her careful positioning of her cubs, and her increasingly sophisticated attempts to convey their desperate situation suggested levels of cognitive ability that seemed impossible for a wild animal. Even more compelling was the documentation of their time inside Michael's home. The mother bear's careful supervision of her cubs, their coordinated cleanup efforts, and their extraordinary respect for human property challenged every known principle of wild animal behavior. Experts were particularly intrigued by the subtle interactions between mother and cubs that suggested a sophisticated system of family communication previously unknown in bears. The footage of their departure preparations became the subject of intense scientific study. Researchers noted dozens of distinct behaviors that indicated levels of awareness and consideration far beyond current understanding of ursine capabilities. The mother bear's systematic inspection of their resting area, her careful cleaning of any marks they had left, and the cubs' coordinated participation in this cleanup routine suggested cognitive abilities that would force a complete re-evaluation of wild animal intelligence. As news of the encounter spread, Michael's cabin became the center of an unprecedented scientific investigation. Teams of researchers installed additional cameras and monitoring equipment throughout his property, hoping to document any further unusual wildlife behavior in the area. The single perfect paw print left in the snow outside his door was carefully preserved and cast, becoming the first piece in what would soon become an extensive collection of evidence of advanced animal intelligence. The footage of the bear's interaction with Michael's cat, Whiskers, particularly intrigued animal behavior experts. The mother bear's careful creation of a non-threatening environment, her subtle positioning of her family to allow the cat safe observation space, and her cub's perfect compliance with her silent instructions suggested levels of social awareness previously thought impossible in wild animals. Universities began establishing dedicated research programs to study the implications of this extraordinary encounter. The footage of the bear's farewell ceremony became required viewing in animal behavior courses worldwide. Students and professors alike analyzed every gesture, every coordinated movement, searching for insights into the previously unknown depths of wild animal intelligence. The scientific community's initial skepticism gradually gave way to excitement as more experts verified the authenticity of the footage. The bear's behavior could not be explained by any known principles of animal psychology or standard protective instincts. Their actions displayed clear evidence of advanced reasoning, social awareness, and even what appeared to be emotional intelligence. Local wildlife services began receiving reports of similar, though less dramatic instances of unusual bear behavior throughout the Adirondacks. While none matched the extraordinary sophistication of Michael's encounter, these reports suggested that the region's bear population might possess previously unrecognized cognitive abilities. Researchers began establishing observation posts throughout the area, hoping to document more examples of advanced ursine intelligence. The impact of this encounter reached far beyond the scientific community. Conservation organizations used the footage to advocate for more sophisticated approaches to wildlife protection, arguing that animals capable of such advanced reasoning deserved greater consideration in environmental policy decisions. The video of the mother bear's careful cleaning and respectful behavior became a powerful tool in promoting responsible wildlife interaction policies. As winter gradually released its grip on the Adirondacks, Michael's security cameras continued their vigilant watch over his property. While the extraordinary family never returned, their visit had transformed his remote cabin into ground zero for a revolutionary shift in our understanding of wild animal intelligence. The perfect paw print left in the snow had long since melted away, but its impact on scientific understanding would prove permanent. Researchers began developing new protocols for studying wild animal behavior, inspired by the sophisticated interactions captured in Michael's footage. The mother bear's complex communication attempts, her family's coordinated behavior, and their remarkable respect for human space suggested possibilities that would reshape the field of animal intelligence research. For generations to come, want to discover more extraordinary stories that will leave you amazed. Every day, somewhere in our vast world, remarkable encounters between humans and wildlife challenge everything we think we know about animal intelligence and behavior. The complexity of wild animal consciousness continues to surprise and humble us, revealing depths of understanding we never thought possible. The extraordinary encounter between Michael and the bear family in the Adirondacks became more than just a viral sensation. It sparked a revolution in our understanding of wildlife behavior and cognitive abilities. The mother bear's sophisticated communication, her family's remarkable coordination, and their incredible display of respect for human Space Force scientists to re-evaluate decades of established research. In the months following this incredible event, Michael's security footage became the cornerstone of new research initiatives at leading universities worldwide. Wildlife experts and animal behaviorists gathered at his remote cabin, establishing sophisticated monitoring systems throughout the property in hopes of documenting more instances of advanced animal intelligence. While the remarkable bear family never returned, their brief visit had transformed our understanding of wild animal capabilities forever. The impact of this encounter continues to ripple through the scientific community today. New research programs focus on discovering previously unrecognized aspects of animal intelligence, inspired by the sophisticated behaviors captured in Michael's footage. Conservation efforts have evolved, incorporating deeper understanding of wildlife cognitive abilities into protection strategies and habitat preservation plans. Perhaps most importantly, this extraordinary encounter reminds us that the natural world still holds countless mysteries waiting to be discovered. Every day brings new opportunities to witness the remarkable intelligence and emotional depth of the creatures we share our planet with. The bear family's visit to Michael's cabin opened our eyes to possibilities we had never imagined, challenging us to approach wildlife with greater respect and understanding. Join us on this journey of discovery as we continue to explore the extraordinary capabilities of wild animals. Subscribe now to receive our most captivating stories straight to your inbox. From remarkable wildlife encounters to groundbreaking scientific discoveries, you'll be among the first to learn about events that challenge our understanding of the natural world. One click is all it takes to never miss another incredible tale. Hit the subscribe button below and become part of our community of nature enthusiasts and wildlife admirers. Together, we'll explore the amazing mysteries that remind us just how extraordinary our world truly is. Remember, every day brings new opportunities to witness remarkable moments that defy explanation. The story of Michael and the bear family teaches us that sometimes the most extraordinary encounters happen when we least expect them. By staying connected with our community, you'll be first to learn about new discoveries that continue to reshape our understanding of wildlife intelligence and behavior. Don't miss out on the next amazing story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about wild animals. Subscribe now and join thousands of readers who receive our most captivating stories delivered directly to them. Let's continue this journey of discovery together, exploring the remarkable capabilities of the creatures who share our world. Your next extraordinary wildlife encounter awaits. Click subscribe now and become part of a community dedicated to sharing and understanding the most remarkable moments in nature. Every story brings new insights, every encounter challenges our assumptions, and every discovery expands our appreciation for the incredible intelligence of wild animals. The bears who visited Michael's cabin that frigid winter morning did more than just survive. They showed us that the natural world still holds countless mysteries waiting to be uncovered. Join us as we continue to document and share these extraordinary moments that remind us just how remarkable our wildlife truly is. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.